His mother had already packed the car, boxes in the trunk, the back seat folded down, a house in Ruwa emptied out over a single weekend in the autumn of 1994. She would tell people later that it was a job in Canada, that the timing was a coincidence, that children move all the time. But Emily was 11 years old, and Emily had drawn something on a piece of paper 3 weeks earlier, and her mother had looked at that drawing and made a decision that a lot of parents in that town made around the same time. Get the child away from Ruwa. Get her away from what happened at the school. And here is the part I keep returning to. Emily did not stop drawing it. Not in Canada. Not for the next 30 years. The same two black eyes over and over until the day she died in 2024. Her family had crossed an ocean to put distance between their daughter and a field behind a schoolyard. And the field came with her. Let's start with what we know. On the morning of September 16th, 1994, a Friday, the Ariel School near Ruwa, Zimbabwe, let its pupils out for mid-morning break. This is a real school. You can find it on a map, about 12 miles east of Harare. It was a private primary school, most of the children from affluent families, many of them white Zimbabwean, some the sons and daughters of diplomats and businessmen. Around 250 children were on the grounds that morning. The teachers, all of them, were inside. There was a staff meeting, and that detail matters, because it means that for a crucial window of time, the only witnesses to what happened were the children themselves. 62 of them would come forward, aged 6 to 12. And they would say that they saw something come down out of the sky. I want to be careful here, because this is the exact point where a story like this usually falls apart. Children exaggerate. Children copy each other. A single loud kid says he saw a spaceship, and by lunchtime, 40 more have seen it too. I know that. Any honest person looking at this case has to sit with that possibility first, before anything else. So, let me give it its full weight. Zimbabwe, 2 nights earlier, had in fact seen a genuine light show in the sky. A Soviet rocket booster, the second stage of a Malmia launch, had re-entered the atmosphere over southern Africa and broken into burning streaks visible across several countries. Millions of people saw it. Newspapers ran it. So by September 16th, the air around Harare was already thick with talk of strange lights. A schoolyard full of children, primed with rocket fire stories, a boring Friday, and one imaginative ringleader. That is a complete, sane, earthbound explanation. And I am not going to pretend it isn't. Here is where it starts to fail to cover the details. Because a re-entering rocket booster is a nighttime streak of fire high in the atmosphere. It is not a silver object the size of a bus that descends into a specific field of scrub and msasa trees, roughly 100 meters beyond the school fence, at 10 in the morning in full daylight, and sits there. And it is not a small figure in a tight black suit that walks along the top of that object while 60 children watch, and then moves, in the words of more than one of them, wrong, not fast, not slow, wrong. That is not the detail someone invents. That's the detail someone remembers. Now I have to introduce you to someone, and I have to be honest with you about who she is, because that honesty is the only thing that makes any of this worth your time. Her name was Coreen Marsh, and she is not in the documentaries. She is not on the Wikipedia page. She was, in September of 1994, a 34-year-old part-time art and remedial teacher at Ariel. And by the accounts of her own family, she was one of the few adults who was not fully inside that staff meeting. She had stepped out. She was crossing the quad toward the tuck shop. And so Coreen Marsh became, as far as I can determine, the only adult member of staff who saw any part of it with her own eyes. I learned about her because her daughter contacted me. I am going to call the daughter Bridget, which is not her name, because she asked me not to use it. Bridget was not born yet in 1994. She grew up with a mother who did not talk about the school, who left teaching entirely by 1997, who moved the family first to Bulawayo, and then in 2001 to a quiet town outside Adelaide in South Australia, as far from Ruwa as a person can reasonably get, and still be on solid ground. Coreen Marsh died of a fast, aggressive cancer in 2011 at 51, and in the last week of her life, in a hospice bed, with her daughter holding a small handheld recorder because Coreen asked her to, she finally described what she saw crossing that quad. That recording exists. It is 43 minutes long. Bridget has played portions of it for me over the phone. She will not send me a copy, and I understand why, and I am not going to press her. I want to sit with what is on that tape because it does not match the version of this case you have heard. And the ways it does not match are the ways that matter. Coreen Marsh did not describe the message. She had never heard the environmental warning, she said, until years later when the documentaries came out. And when she heard it, she said it made her uneasy because it was too clean. That was her word on the tape, her daughter told me. Too clean. What she described instead was much smaller and much stranger. She said she came around the corner of the classroom block and she saw perhaps 40 children standing at the fence. Not running, not screaming yet, standing dead still, all facing the same direction, like grass laid flat by wind. And she said the first thing she noticed, before she even saw the object, was that she could not hear them. 40 children. And no sound. No sound. Let me say it again, because she said it 3 times on the tape. No sound. This is the thing that turns up in the serious accounts, across decades and across continents, in cases the witnesses could not possibly have coordinated. The wrong silence. Not quiet. The sense that sound itself has been switched off at the source. It is in the Betty and Barney Hill case in New Hampshire in 1961, the first widely documented American abduction account. Examined under hypnosis by a Boston psychiatrist named Benjamin Simon, who, for the record, did not believe his patients had actually been aboard a craft and thought the memories were a shared emotional fantasy. Even the skeptical doctor could not explain away the consistency. The silence is there. It is in Travis Walton's account from the Sitgreaves Apache Forest in Arizona in 1975, when a logging crew watched a man get struck by a beam of light and vanish for 5 days. It is in the Pascagoula, Mississippi encounter of 1973, when 2 shipyard workers, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, said they were taken aboard a craft by the river. And Parker, decades later, still could not talk about it without his voice breaking. The children in Ruwa were 6 to 12 years old. They had not read any of these cases. And their teacher, dying in Australia 17 years later, described the silence. Once you notice the silence, you cannot unnotice it. The first serious investigator to reach the school was not an American, and I want to flag that early because we are going to spend a lot of time with Americans in this story, and it matters that they came second. The first was a BBC correspondent named Tim Leach, based in Zimbabwe. He heard about it, he was skeptical, and he went out on September 19th with a camera and interviewed the children on tape. Leach had covered wars. He had reported from the Zimbabwean bush during genuinely brutal years. He was not a man who spooked easily. And after his time at that school, listening to those children, Tim Leach said a sentence I cannot get out of my head. He said that he could handle war zones, but he could not handle this. I could handle war zones, but I could not handle this. Sit with that. A professional journalist whose whole job was to stay unmoved in front of terrible things, and a field full of primary school children broke something in him that artillery had not. The next to arrive was Cynthia Hind. Hind was the leading UFO researcher in southern Africa, based in Harare, and she went to the school on September 20th. She did the thing you are supposed to do. She separated the children into small groups. She gave them paper and pencils. She asked them, without leading, to draw what they had seen. And when the drawings came back, they showed the same thing. A disc, a dark figure, 2 enormous black eyes, over and over from children interviewed apart from each other. Hind made a point that skeptics have spent 30 years trying to answer and have never fully answered. These were not American kids raised on a diet of Spielberg and gray alien merchandise. Rural Zimbabwe in 1994 was not saturated with the pop culture image of the almond-eyed gray the way an American suburb was. And yet the almond-eyed gray is what they drew. And then came the American, the one whose name is now welded to this case forever. And this is where it gets complicated, so I have to slow down. John Edward Mack was not a fringe figure. I need you to understand that before anything else, because it is the single most important fact for an American audience to hold on to. Mack was a tenured professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He had won the Pulitzer Prize in 1977 for a biography of T.E. Lawrence. He founded the Department of Psychiatry at Cambridge Hospital. This was, by any measure, one of the most credentialed men in American academic medicine. He was the establishment. And in the early 1990s, this man torched his own reputation by beginning to take alien abduction accounts seriously, to the point that Harvard actually opened an inquiry into him for it, an almost unheard of thing to do to a tenured professor. That inquiry hung over him. And in November of 1994, John Mack got on a plane and flew roughly 8,000 miles from Boston to Zimbabwe to interview those children. That is the setup. A Harvard man crosses an ocean, and what he brought back is either the most important testimony of his career or the exact moment his critics had been waiting for. Because here is the honest problem with John Mack, and I am not going to hide it from you. The most famous part of this whole case, the part everyone repeats, is the telepathic message. The children, or some of them, said the beings communicated without speaking and put a warning directly into their minds. A warning about the earth, about pollution, about the air and the trees and the technology and the way people were living, that we were going to make the planet unlivable. One boy told Mack he was shown, in his head, the world with the trees gone. And the uncomfortable truth is that this environmental message shows up strongly in Mack's interviews, and much more faintly, if at all, in the earlier reports from Leach and Hind. Mack was himself a passionate environmentalist. Skeptics say the obvious thing, and they are not wrong to say it. A man who believes the aliens are here to warn us about the planet flies in, sits with impressionable children, asks his questions in what he himself called a co-creative process, and lo and behold, the children produce a message about the planet. That is a fair criticism. I am not going to wave it away. When you ask a child a warm, leading question in a warm, encouraging voice, a child will very often give you what you seem to want. But the craft was in the earliest reports. The figure was in the earliest reports. The eyes were in the earliest reports, drawn by children who had never met Mack 3 weeks before Mack landed. And the silence, remember, was in Coreen Marsh's account. And Coreen Marsh distrusted Mack's message precisely because it was too clean. The message may be Mack's contamination. The encounter was not. This is the distinction that took me a long time to get straight in my own head. So let me say it plainly. You can strip John Mack out of this case entirely, throw away every word he recorded, and you are still left with 62 children, a BBC journalist who covered wars and came away shaken, a stack of matching drawings, and a teacher who crossed a quad into a wall of silence and carried it to a hospice in Australia. Mack is the part of this case you are allowed to doubt. He is not the case. Now I want to give you the thing that has kept me up, the thing that is not in any documentary, and I have to tell you exactly where it comes from so you can weigh it yourself. On Coreen Marsh's tape, near the end, her daughter asked her the obvious question. What did the figure look like? And Coreen, who was further back than the children, who saw it for maybe 4 or 5 seconds before a teacher behind her started shouting and the spell broke, said she could not describe its face. She said she was too far to see a face, but she said something about the way it turned to look at the children, and she used a phrase her daughter had never heard her use before or since. She said it gave them the long stare, and then, on the tape, She is quiet for a while, and then she says, and I am quoting her daughter, quoting the recording as closely as she could, "It wasn't looking at them. It was looking into them." And I think a piece of it stayed. The long stare. A piece of it stayed. I have turned that over and over. Because here is what I found when I went looking. Emily Trim, the girl whose mother packed the car, described as an adult almost exactly this. She said she made eye contact with one of the beings, that she could not look away, that it was as though the eyes were putting something inside her, and that she spent her whole life afterward trying to get it back out through her art. She did not know Coreen Marsh. She was a child at the fence. Coreen was an adult behind them who left teaching and left the country and told no one for 17 years. And they described the same thing. A look that goes the wrong direction. A look that leaves a residue. I want to be careful here. I am not telling you that Coreen Marsh and Emily Trim confirm each other in any way a court would accept. One account is a hospice tape a grieving daughter will not release. The other is a woman's lifelong artistic testimony. Neither is proof of anything, but I keep coming back to the shape of it. Two people, an adult and a child, on opposite ends of that field, who did not speak for the rest of their lives, describing the same impossible thing in nearly the same words. The eyes that go in the wrong direction, the piece that stays. And this pattern, the message without sound, the look that transmits rather than receives, is not unique to Ruwa. It runs through the documented American abduction record for decades, from Betty Andreasen in Massachusetts to the men in the Allagash wilderness of Maine in 1976. Adult experiencers describing telepathic contact and something placed in them they could never fully name. The children of Ruwa walked into a pattern that adults on another continent had already been walking into for 30 years. They just did it in daylight, in front of 60 witnesses, at recess. Now I have to talk about the part that troubles me most, which is not the presence of evidence. It is the absence of it. John Mack recorded his interviews, on video, on audio, with extensive written notes. Hours of it. 60 children, on tape, telling one of the most significant mass witness accounts in the history of the subject. That footage should be one of the most carefully preserved archives in the field. John Mack died in 2004, struck by a drunk driver in London, and his materials passed into the hands of the institute he founded and the people around him. And when the filmmaker Randall Nickerson spent years, and I mean years, assembling the 2022 documentary about this case, one of the recurring difficulties, spoken about openly, was the sheer struggle of tracking down that original footage. Material everyone agreed existed, that had to be chased across continents and dug out of storage, and in some cases nearly did not surface at all. Tapes are like that. They get transferred, and the transfer is what survives. A copy of a copy, the master gone. Somebody borrows the original, and it is never quite returned. A box gets moved, and the label comes off. And Coreen Marsh's tape is worse, because it may be the only adult staff eyewitness account that exists, and it lives on a single handheld recording in a house outside Adelaide, guarded by a daughter who does not want her mother's dying voice turned into a YouTube clip. I have heard pieces of it read down a phone line. That is the entire chain of custody. When Bridget is gone, or if the recorder fails, that account is gone with it. The most important adult witness to the most documented mass sighting of the modern era, and her testimony hangs by one cassette in one drawer on the far side of the world. I want to state the principle as plainly as I can, because I think it is the real subject here. In this field, the record thins precisely where it should be thickest. The single most professionally witnessed mass encounter of the modern era. And the closer you get to the primary material, the harder it is to hold in your hand. I am not going to tell you that is a conspiracy. I think the truth is more troubling and more human than a conspiracy. I think it is what happens when a thing is too strange to be filed and too important to throw away. So it sits in a drawer and the drawer gets moved, and no institution is quite responsible for it. And the years pass, and the people who were there start to die. Because they are dying. Cynthia Hind died in 2000. John Mack died in 2004. Coreen Marsh died in 2011. And Emily Trim, the girl whose mother packed the car, the woman who returned to that schoolyard as an adult and stood in the field and wept on camera, died in November of 2024, not yet 40. The witnesses are becoming a closing file, and when the last of the 62 is gone, what will be left is a stack of children's drawings, a documentary that nearly couldn't find its own footage, a BBC reporter's sentence about war zones, and 43 minutes of a dying woman's voice that almost no one will ever be allowed to hear. So let me leave you where the case leaves me. Not with an answer. I don't have one. What did Tim Leach see in those children's faces that he had never seen in a war? Why did so many families quietly leave Ruwa in the months after, telling no one the real reason? And why did the one teacher who saw it leave teaching leave the country and stay silent for 17 years? What did the children draw before Mac ever landed? And where did the almond eyes come from in a place that had never sold them the image? If it was mass hysteria, why? The silence, the specific wrong silence that a grown woman crossing a quad walked straight into. Why did the message, whoever put it there, always come out as a warning and never as anything else? What is the long stare? And why does it appear in the mouth of a dying teacher in Australia and a grieving artist in Canada who never once spoke to each other? Why does the footage that should be easiest to find turn out to be the hardest? And if something came down into that field and looked into those children and left a piece of itself behind, then what did it want? And did it get it? I don't know. I have read everything I could find, and I have listened to what I was allowed to hear, and I don't know. But it does not look like the pattern of a lie. Lies are smooth. This is jagged. This looks like the pattern of a secret. 62 children, one teacher, one field, the same 2 eyes. The car was packed, the ocean was crossed, and the field came with her anyway.